Hello viewers, welcome to week 2, lecture 1 of the Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. In this lecture, we are going to talk about F.R. Lewis as a critic. In the previous lectures, last week we talked about the introduction to literary criticism and theory, and we talked about T.S. Eliot and his contribution to modern literary criticism. So, F.R. Lewis was an important literary critic who synthesizes the critical principles of T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards in literary criticism. We can say that if we understand modern literary criticism in form of a triangle, so Eliot, Richards are two poles, Lewis is the third pole, right? And Lewis is significant in a way that he emphasizes the moral dimension of literary criticism. And the quality of Lewis's criticism lies in the fact that he does not dilute literary criticism at the cost of moral concerns in appreciation of literature. So, this unique balance that we find between art and morality, art and ethics, that makes Lewis unique. And of course, he did a lot in propounding close textual study by his writings and by the methods of criticism. For a long time, he edited Scrutiny, a magazine which was very influential and which played a very important role in shaping the taste of literature. In his later years, Lewis developed a mode of literary criticism marked by an Arnoldian concern for moralistic humanism. So, in a way, this liberal humanism aspect is very evident in F.R. Lewis's literary criticism. We notice that the early works of literary criticism, they can be seen very much under the impact of T.S. Eliot and Richards. Primarily, Eliot's critical speculations and principles, influenced Lewis a lot. For example, his book New Bearings in English Poetry, it expands on several of T.S. Eliot's views. His book Revaluation, which was published in 1936, Lewis applies Eliot's critical methods to study the history and development of English poetry. His book The Common Pursuit, which was published in 1952, it derives its titles from Eliot's essay on criticism. In the later phase of his career, his works like The Living Principle, English as a Discipline of Thought, and Thought, Words and Creativity, Arts and Thought in Lawrence, they are also significant. F.R. Lewis is also known for his landmark work, The Great Tradition, in which he identifies 5 writers. Primarily, he identified 4. Later on, D.H. Lawrence was added to that group. So, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James and Joseph Conrad, they constitute the great tradition of English literature so far as fiction writing is concerned. It is important to mention this work because in England, we find that this focus on novel is missing in literary criticism. Whatever literary criticism we read, like earlier, it was focused either on poetry or drama or prose or any other genre of literature, but fiction for a long time remained, ignored from the critical attention of critics. It is very surprising that we know Henry James, who wrote The Art of Fiction in 1884, which can be seen as a first attempt by any critic to look into the nature and function of novel as a genre. But after that, there has been a long silence and critics have been focusing on other genres than fiction. So in that way, Lewis is also important for various factors. In the later part of the lecture, we will be talking about other works of Lewis like New Bearings in English Poetry. We will be talking about the salient features of Revaluation or even the Great Tradition, which are important works. So, let us look at some of the principles that Lewis propounds, like what Lewis says about the technique of analysis. He considers that, literary criticism should be literary. So, he very strongly emphasizes that literary criticism should be shorn of biohistorical approaches. So, there should be a balance. It is not that, one thing is important to understand here, that when we are talking about critics like Eliot or Richards or Lewis, who are the founding, members of this modern criticism, these critics are, of course, drawing our attention towards putting focus on the text itself, the intrinsic features of the text, but it is not that they are trying to decontextualize the text from all its dimensions. That is difference between these propounders of modern criticism and the new critics. That difference we will keep in mind. Let us see what Lewis says about analysis. So he says, analysis, one would go on, is the process by which we seek to attain a complete reading of the poem, a reading that approaches as nearly as possible to the perfect reading. There is about it nothing in the nature of murdering to dissect, and suggestions that it can be anything in the nature of laboratory method to misrepresent it entirely. We can have the poem only by an inner kind of possession. It is therefore analysis only insofar as we are responding appropriately to the words on the page. So if we look at his view of analysis, technique of analysis, we find that he is also taking the middle path. He is not on the side of murdering to dissect. The same way Eliot himself dissociated from the new critics. He called them humorously lemon squeezing school, right? So, it should not be done, and at the same time, we should not lose focus of words on the page. So, in a way, Lewis is, asking to adopt an inclusive approach, a balanced approach, which looks at art, which looks at a poem as poem itself, and at the same time, by its analysis, it is also able to evolve certain moral and ethical principles. Lewis's influence on literary criticism was very deep and pervasive. For example, in context of India, we find that his admirers and detractors both are there. Critics may have issues with the judgment that Lewis gave on various works. They may be controvertible, they may be debatable, but the new approach to literary criticism, in which he emphasized the sincerity, right, in which he emphasized ethics, they are unique. For example, C.D. Narasimhaiah, one of the stalwarts of Indian writing in English and a representative of India, right, he writes, Lewis affected us more pervasively. We accepted him almost unquestioningly because he affected us by his recourse to practical criticism, by his demonstration of the actual organization of the poem as an object in front of us, rather than the poet, the background material, the ethos, the message, the philosophy, all of which had figured prominently before him in our study of poetry. Above all, he taught us to make the necessary, challenging discrimination in life, and indiscrimination is death. And because one did not live like Methuselah for 969 years, and so one has no time for anything but the very best. So here we find that how Narasimhaiah is praising Lewis for demonstrating a method in literary criticism in which the focus is on poet, not on any other information. At the same time, Rajnath has another important figure in literary criticism from India, right? So he says that he finds some problems with Lewis's method. He says that Lewis looks at writers. So he, though his focus is on the words, of course, the body of words, but he takes writers as a whole and he tries to distinguish as good writer and bad writer. And in a way, Rajnath objects to this wholesale condemnation or praise of writers that Lewis takes up. For example, if Lewis says that Wordsworth is a good poet and he says that Shelley is a bad poet, in his Revaluation, he has launched a vitriolic attack on Shelley. So the point is that it is not that all the poems written by Wordsworth are good. Wordsworth might also have written some bad poems, and it is also not possible that Shelley has written all bad poems, right? So these kinds of problems in Lewis's criticism, they have also been pointed out. So Lewis defended the task of literary criticism and believed that the study of literature must be an integral part of liberal education. Being a humanist critic, he always advocated for the moral use of literature. This sets him apart from the so-called new critics who held a sort of art for art's sake stance in their literary criticism. According to William Walsh, Lewis's effort was to open a connection between sensibility and practical judgment, and to display the resources of literary taste in the interest of general civility, and to do this by bringing into conscious relation and articulate contrast the structure of our daily action. So we can say that how Lewis insisted on the continuity between language and ethics and believed that a real literary interest is an interest in man, society and civilization. Ren Welek says about F.R. Lewis, Lewis sharply criticized the commercialization and standardization of English literacy life and defended the need for tradition, for a social code and order, for maturity, sanity and tradition. Thus, we can say that Lewis, along with T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards, remains one of the most influential critics who gave 20th century literary criticism a fresh direction and a renewed sense of purpose. Let us talk about the works of Lewis, and salient features about that. For example, New Bearings in English Poetry, which was published in 1932. It was, an early work, or we can say an early major work of F.R. Lewis, which provides insights into his own critical positions. This work was solely devoted to the analysis and discussion of modernist poets. For example, he discusses in detail G.M. Hopkins, William Butler Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and he identifies that what these writers have done, and in that way, at the hands of these writers, what modern poetry has achieved. See, like Eliot, Lewis goes on to emphasize the importance of the metaphysical poets, the qualities of the metaphysical poets that Eliot has, pointed out in his essay, right? For example, this unification of sensibility, that is something Lewis also points out. And Lewis says that, these metaphysical poets have a lot of things which can inspire modern poets. And modern poetry, if it is desperately looking for achieving new goals, looking for reviving English poetry, so they should, look back to the metaphysical poets. Lewis was very critical of the Victorian poets, particularly Tennyson or Arnold. And what he says, he attacked the Victorian ideal, suggesting that how the 19th century poetry sought the consciously poetical and showed a separation of thought and feeling and the divorce from the real world. But among those poets, he was full of praise for G.M. Hopkins. And about Hopkins, he says, he finds that Hopkins, innovated English poetry, right? And the technical experiments that he did with English poetry, it was unique. The maximum use of resources of English language that could offer to a poet, nobody knows better than Hopkins. He says that, quote, his words seem to have substance and to be made of a great variety of stuffs. The intellectual and spiritual anemia of Victorian poetry is indistinguishable from its lack of body. This is quoted in R.P. Billan's book. So, this is what we've seen. The other important work by F.R. Lewis is Revaluation, and the subtitle of that work is Tradition and Development in English Poetry. So, if we look at these works, for example, either New Bearings in English Poetry, his emphasis on the metaphysical poets, or the metaphysical quality of poetry, the metaphysical poetry as the best kind of poetry, or even Revaluation, the word like tradition. Even in the later work, The Great Tradition, we find that how for a longer time, Lewis grew as a distinguished critic, but only under the shadow of T.S. Eliot. So, Eliot's influence, can be understood even by this. This book, Revaluation, is noted for contributing to the systematization of English as a discipline in university, right? He, in this book, he points out to the need for separating literary criticism from biography and for a criticism that is based on precise terms. Lewis begins with the analysis of poetry of the 17th century and ends with Keats, and in doing so, he seeks to illuminate the main strengths of development in English tradition, right? In this work, he discusses in detail poets like John Donne, Milton, Alexander Pope, William Wordsworth, Shelley and Keats, and he gives his opinion on all these writers frankly by evaluating their writings. He praises Donne for his originality and integration of poetry, music and dramatic elements, right? At the same time, he is very critical of two writers that those are Milton and Shelley. Milton's language is critiqued for being detached from actual speech, though his moral purpose and musical verse are admired. So, if we read this work, Revaluation, we find that in a way it is a very complex system of comparing internally differentiated bodies of work against each other. For example, if we say that 4 tools of literary criticism are giving judgment or interpretation, analysis, evaluation and comparison, I think all these tools can be best seen at use in this work of Lewis. He does not hesitate to deflate Milton, who apparently wrote so much Latin poetry that he forgot how to write English. And Pope is elevated, confirmed as the only true great poet, whatever great is supposed to mean, other than an appeal to our institutions, poet of the 18th century. Lucky that my institutions agree here, he says. And towards the end of this work, he comes to the analysis of Keats's writing. Right, here he gives his judgment, right, that Shelley and Milton, they represent very bad tradition of poetry, right. And on the other hand, he admires writers like Pope and Keats effectively, right. One thing that distinguishes Lewis from Eliot, that when Lewis looks at the tradition of English poetry, it is not that, like Eliot, he is giving a wholesale condemnation of the entire romantic and neoclassical poetry, right. So, Lewis is able to find this unification of sensibility, a typical metaphysical feature in the writings of Pope, in the writings of Keats. He declares that, in Pope, if you read his work, there is a nice balance of feelings and thought, mind and heart, intellectuality and emotional aspect. Similarly, he says that Keats is a better poet than Shelley and Byron. And he says that because the facts, the object of contemplation, absorbed the poet's attention completely. He had none left for his feelings as such. The other important work of Lewis, as I have already mentioned, is the Great Tradition. Right, the Great Tradition was very important work in which he evolves parameters for judging the tradition of fiction in England, and it generated some controversy as well, because in Lewis's criteria, very few writers are able to pass the test of the best. For example, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Joseph Conrad, Henry James, and D.H. Lawrence. Much to the surprise of the readers, writers like Charles Dickens, who was very popular during the Victorian age and he wrote copiously, or writers like Hardy, who wrote in a sustained manner, they are kept out of the purview. And he says that this tradition of fiction, two set parameters are art and morality, the form and ethics, the form and morality, right. So, the nice combination. For example, if you look at the works of Jane Austen or George Eliot or Henry James or Joseph Conrad or Lawrence, he says that there you find a nice balance of technical consciousness that a writer should have towards art and moral and ethical concerns. So, nobody can disagree with Lewis that of course they are one of the finest fiction writers, and that cannot be disputed. But what is disputed, that many others who are left out of this ambit, Lewis sets out his conception of proper relationship between form, composition and moral or art in life. He further considers that writers like Charles Dickens, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, they can be seen as successors of Shakespeare. Right. So, these judgments are very important. The Common Pursuit is another important work of Lewis. It is Lewis's best known collection of essays which were originally published in the Scrutiny. It includes his robust defense of Milton against Eliot, his deeply felt engagement with Shakespeare, and his severe strictures on attempts to import sociology, political activism into the study of literature. Lewis disparages T.S. Eliot for suggesting that the critic must engage in the common pursuit of true judgment. For Lewis, this judgment meant a strenuous insistence on discriminatory criticism. The book remained challenging for its controversial judgments of authors like John Bunyan, W. H. Auden, Jonathan Swift, and E. M. Forster. Other important works of Lewis are Literary Criticism and Philosophy, right? In this essay, Literary Criticism and Philosophy, Lewis attempts to defend the position he had taken earlier in the book Revaluation as a response to the review of his book by Reinwelek. Reinwelek had said that how, Lewis had separated philosophy and art, So this is what Lewis is trying to defend. Since for Lewis, literary criticism and philosophy are two separate disciplines. He argues that reading demanded by poetry is altogether different from reading applied to philosophy. So he believes in distinction between the two. In one of his responses, Lewis says, philosophy is abstract, whereas poetry is concrete. He writes, words in poetry invite us not to think about and judge, but to feel into or become, to realize a complex experience that is given in words. They demand not merely a fuller body's response, but a completer responsiveness that is incompatible with the judicial, one eye on the standard approach suggested by Dr. Welek's phrase, your norm with which you measure every poet. He gives his opinions about Blake, about Wordsworth and Shelley, and he says that all these writers are so different in their philosophies that it is very difficult to keep them together under any one philosophical approach. So that is how he gives his, explanation. Lewis, further considers that charges levied against him. He says that he did not pay heed to Wordsworth's philosophy while evaluating the latter's poetry. He clarifies, my business was with Wordsworth's poetry. I never proposed and do not propose now to consider him as a philosophical thinker. Right. So, however, he gives his views in defense of what he has said about Shelley, though the point remains controversial, but this essay is noteworthy for its differentiation between poetry and philosophy and its outlining of the role of a literary critic. Right. So, literary criticism, Lewis insists that should never cease to be literary. So, in this way, I come to the end of this lecture, and in this lecture, we have evaluated or we have, assessed F.R. Lewis as a critic. We have focused on his major works, his critical positions that he has taken in all these works. With these words, I end this lecture. Thank you.